Washoe County Library System welcomes you to our monthly series from the Nevada Historical Society presents High Noon with Neal Cobb. This afternoon's topic is about the Friends of Nevada Wilderness and Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge with Pat Bruce. My name is Samantha, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. And now I'd like to introduce Sherry Hayes Zorn with the Nevada Historical Society. Again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And welcome everybody for joining us today for our High Noon series. We so appreciate working with the Washoe County Libraries, helping get our programming out to everybody. And so if you're not able to attend live Zoom, we'll have it available on our website and of course the library's website here in the next week or so. So that's a wonderful thing about with Zoom for us, is that people can watch these programs at any time. So we're very happy to be able to provide this for you today. So without further ado, let me introduce our honorary curator and wonderful historian who's supported the Historical Society for many years, Neal Cobb. I don't think he really needs much introduction actually, but is a wonderful person who we've worked with and has really made this program wonderful, finding great speakers from the community. And we really appreciate working with Neal. So let me introduce Neal.
Sherry, thanks a million. Our speaker today, Pat Bruce, the Stewardship Program Director at the Sheldon area. Pat Bruce joined the staff in February 2006 as Friends of Nevada Wilderness Field Project Coordinator. Pat oversees Friends of Nevada Wilderness as growing and nationally recognized wilderness stewardship program and the FNW Safety and Training Program. Since 2008, Pat has coordinated volunteers and crews on the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. Pat brings a wealth of experience to this job, including years of managing volunteers and programs from the Boy Scouts to archaeological field schools at the University of Nevada, Reno. Pat was born in Scotland and has lived in Nevada since 1982. Pat became a U.S. citizen and public lands owner in August of 2020. With a BA in anthropology from the University of Nevada, Pat focused on early man sites in the Great Basin. Pat has grown with the Friends of Nevada Wilderness Stewardship Program from its inception into nationally recognized program, winning the Bob Marshall Award for Group Championship of Wilderness Stewardship in 2008 and 2012. He was personally awarded the BLM's prestigious Making a Difference National Volunteer Awards ceremony in Washington, D.C. Pat was the founder of the Black Rock NCA. This is the Dutch Oven Cook-Off, and received multiple awards for his Dutch oven skills. Pat loves Nevada and is dedicated to ensuring the state's wild places are protected and preserved. Please welcome Mr. Pat Bruce.
Thank you, Neal. Thank you, Sherry, as well. And I'm happy to be here today on behalf of Friends of Nevada Wilderness to introduce all of you to our program and our organization, as well as to get you familiar with the Greater Hart-Sheldon region in Northern Nevada and Southeastern Oregon. And what I'd like today to accomplish today is to give you a quick introduction to the organization. And we'll start off with our website. It's a pretty valuable resource for anybody interested in the state of Nevada, both in history and geology and geography. the website is an important resource for anyone traveling the state and has interest in any of the wild places out there. But in particular, the presentation today will be on the Sheldon Refuge, and I'll show everyone how to access Esri-based story map that we put together for the 90th anniversary of the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. And it can be viewed at any time by going through our website and clicking on the link that I will describe. Once we get to the map, I'll give an introduction to the landscape of the Sheldon region, then into the whole reason that the Sheldon Refuge was established, which is the Pronghorn, and then go into some refuge history, some of the wildlife species that are on the refuge, and then go into our work as an organization with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. And then we'll have opportunities for folks to ask questions immediately following that. So without further ado, we'll click on to the Friends of Nevada Wilderness website, and I will share my screen. For anyone interested in Nevada and Nevada's wild places, obviously we're on the Friends of Nevada Wilderness website, and the URL is in the chat box for anyone interested, but nevadawilderness.org. And we basically are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We've been officially 501c3 since 1985. Our executive director was the first full-time employee hired by the organization. She's been with the organization for over 20 years now. I have, as Neal mentioned, I think it'll be 16 years starting February of next year. So we have a lot of folks that are long-term advocates of conservation in Nevada, but we also in our organization have built a nice, established a nice tradition of bringing younger people into the organization. And I've moved out of the position now of Stewardship Program Director and into a public lands policy position. And some younger and more capable folks have taken over for me in that capacity and have taken over this stewardship on Nevada wildlands. We have an office in Reno and we have an office in Las Vegas. We are focused on conservation and stewardship of the entire state of Nevada, on focusing particularly on wilderness and wilderness quality lands within the state. We are in a very heavy public lands occupied state as far as federally managed lands. And it's important for everyone to realize the actual, I guess it's a national treasure that we have in public lands here. Most countries in the world don't have public lands in the concept that we think about public lands here. And it's important for us to think that it's not government land. It's not necessarily state land. It's managed by the federal government for the American people, in trust for the American people. And it's an important distinction to make. The Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, the U.S. Park Service, all manage wilderness and wilderness quality lands in the state of Nevada and across the country for the American people. And we have agreements with all 4 agencies that manage these lands in Nevada to help them manage public lands for the American people. We use volunteers. We also use paid crews, and we use AmeriCorps service members to accomplish this work and help the federal government in the managing of public lands across the state. So the way that we operate is generally we have private grants and foundation money, as well as federal assistance agreements with the agencies that allow us to fund the projects that we do to work on public lands. And particularly in the Sheldon region, the work that you'll see in the presentation today is all accomplished primarily by private funds that we take from the Greater Hart-Sheldon Conservation Fund and put into action on the ground within the refuge at Sheldon. We have a small contribution from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service financially, and then they give us an in-kind match with housing, vehicles, and support for the entire season. And then a couple of other private foundations, the Wilberforce Foundation in particular, do apply funds to the Sheldon as well. And so the majority of this work that has been done has been accomplished without public funding or taxpayer money. So it's important to remember that as we go forward. So from our webpage, go to the Explore button, click on Explore, and travel down the page to the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. There's a blue link. Click on the story map, and this will be the focus of our presentation today. The photographs that you see throughout this presentation are from either staff members for Friends of Nevada Wilderness or volunteers or photographers that have donated their photographs to our organization to use in the course of our work. And there's some pretty incredible photographs. There's also a number of photographs here that have been taken by actual crew members and crew leaders that have worked on the refuge for us. So the way our operation works on the Sheldon Refuge, as Neal mentioned, since 2008, we've been working with volunteers up there. About 10 years ago, we approached the Fish and Wildlife Service and basically asked them what their priorities were on the refuge. And within our capacity, one of the things that we chose to tackle was the removal of unneeded relic water developments, fencing structures, and barbed wire fencing in general from the refuge. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated that there was about 100 miles of barbed wire fence on the refuge, and we thought that we could accomplish the removal of that with the help of AmeriCorps service members, and that we would be able to do that in a couple of years of work by hiring a crew and housing them on the refuge and having them work through a season. We didn't realize, and I don't think Fish and Wildlife Service realized how much fence was actually out there, but we are still removing fence from the refuge. And I'll go through some numbers later on, and you can see visual representations of the maps of the work that we've done towards the end of the presentation here. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the Sheldon region. And one of the things that we think about when we think about high desert is our general area now. And what we look at in Sheldon is kind of a northern transition into the Columbia Plateau. It's called the sagebrush steppe ecosystem. And we're very lucky to have that. In some of the work that we've been doing with other organizations like the Oregon Natural Desert Association, there's been some contractors that have been hired that have done scientific research that shows that this Hart-Sheldon region that we'll be discussing here is one of the most resilient ecosystems in the face of best case scenario and worst case scenario climate change models. It shows that this region has the best ability of anywhere in the state to survive and have a thriving ecosystem despite any of those challenges. This view from Big Springs Butte in Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge is kind of representative of the special places and scenes that you get to experience when you're up in the refuge. So again, Friends of Nevada Wilderness has been spearheading this project with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We created this Esri-based story map to showcase the work that we've done in Sheldon with the help of the Greater Hart-Sheldon Conservation Fund. Our mission is that we're dedicated to preserving all qualified Nevada public lands as wilderness, protecting all present and potential wilderness from ongoing threats, educating the public about the values of and need for wilderness, and improving the management and restoration of wildlands across the state. As I said, our partner organization is the Greater Hart-Sheldon Conservation Fund. And I will read their mission, and I will stop reading from the slides from here on, trust me. The Greater Hart-Sheldon Conservation Fund will be used to conserve and restore the high desert sagebrush steppe ecosystem within and surrounding the Hart Mountain National Antelope Refuge in southeastern Oregon and the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge in northwestern Nevada. The fund exists to ensure the healthy wildlife habitat and connectivity in this area, spanning from the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge to the Black Rock Desert, is sustained for future generations. And the fund is actually money that was put aside to mitigate from the construction of the Ruby Pipeline. And so we are benefiting from that. As I said before, the Sheldon Refuge is intensely remote. It's extremely rugged country, and even traveling in the area on the roads is something of an adventure. There are no services within the refuge. It's almost 900 square miles, and there's not a lot of help if anything happens out there, and there's certainly not much cell service. So anyone visiting will really have a very solitary experience and see things as they were long ago. Some of the darkest places in the world are up in the Sheldon region. So some rough numbers. Basically, the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge is almost 900 square miles. It's northwestern Nevada. If you look just above the black box where the text is, that's the corner of California and Nevada with the Oregon border at the top. The Sheldon Refuge itself is the dark green area, and the line running down about 1/3 through is the Washoe County boundary in Nevada. So the Washoe County goes all the way to the Oregon border, and just to the east of Catnip Mountain there, you can see the line of the county going down, and then we're into Humboldt County to the east. The area is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the broader region, as I said before, and is the name in the funder that we use, the Greater Hart Sheldon Conservation Fund. Hart Mountain is about 18 miles north of the northernmost boundary of the Sheldon Refuge at the Oregon border there. And that area in between is what you see as Sagehen Flats and Hoxie-Woxie Valley. That is one of the major migration routes of the pronghorn. And amazingly, even sage grouse travel back and forth between those two refuges. The area itself is long been occupied, and as much as 12 to 14,000 years ago, people were using this area for subsistence, and the refuge itself is part of the ancestral lands of the Northern Paiute. When you get up to the refuge, these signs of these early people are visible, obviously, if you know where to look. But folks 12 to 14,000 years ago were exploiting megafauna that's obviously no longer here. Giant ground sloth, Pleistocene beaver, saber-toothed cat, short-faced bear. And these were animals that were mobile and moved around these areas. And the people hunted these large animals, as well as exploiting the resources of the lake shores and marshes. As things began to dry out, the Pleistocene megafauna kind of moved towards extinction. The cultures shifted to utilizing marshes and lacustrine resources for survival. And they started to kind of move around the plateaus and down to the lowlands, depending on the season, to find different crops and wildlife. The foraging kind of lifestyle would kind of move around across the landscapes, and depending on the season, Sheldon offered a number of different environments to live in during the seasons. The higher areas offered snowless areas because of the winds on the higher elevations. On the tables within the refuge, it doesn't allow snow to build up, and it offered a place for pronghorn to winter. And people built residential camps down in the valleys during that time, and then moved up to the higher resource or the higher areas in the summer to exploit those resources and get out of the hot lowlands. Yeah, there's a rich cultural history within the refuge. Obviously, it's part of a history that continues to this day. Just to the south of the refuge is the Summit Lake Paiute Reservation. There are still folks living up there at this point. some of the earliest visitation to the refuge was in efforts to find cross-country routes for people coming into the area. The Sheldon offered kind of lowland routes in between the large tables to go from the East Coast into the West as people were moving to the West as part of the early days. Survey and mapping didn't really occur systematically out there until the late 1800s. But in the 1860s, through a series of acts, homesteading acts, settlers moved into the region and started to use these large grasslands as bases for livestock. The ranching company Miller and Lux kind of consolidated most of these private lands in northwestern Nevada by the early 1900s. And a lot of these structures still remain on the refuge. And this in particular is the IXL Ranch in the northwestern part of the refuge. After these folks had come in and started to raise cattle in the area, the horse trading became one of the big businesses out in that area. And one of the reasons was that the horses that lived or were raised out in this area were able to cover some really difficult ground. They made excellent stock for the military. They were just really suited for some really rough conditions. Year round up there, the temperatures can swing wildly. And to have this heavy stock with good solid constitutions and good feet were a bonus. And one of the things, as far as the horses go, during this early time of horse trading and moving horses across the landscape up here, many of them ended up feral and began living out in the area of the Sheldon Refuge. As things were developed for commercial livestock operations, the vegetation deteriorated, ground conditions were decimated really in a lot of places. And then sheep came in the 20s and things just became very serious for the ecosystem in the Sheldon region. And as a consequence of all these livestock operations, many things were built and abandoned, and a lot of them were left intact for years and years. In fact, until we as an organization pulled them out more recently. But by the 30s, it really became apparent that something needed to be done to both protect the landscape and protect the pronghorn. For those of you that are familiar with the pronghorn antelope in the Sheldon region, I mean, that's specifically what the refuge was established to protect. This is one of my favorite pictures relating to pronghorn. It comes from National Geographic magazine. The pronghorn is the fastest mammal in North America, and it evolved to escape the American cheetah, which is what you see in this picture, following a pronghorn that prehistorically had a completely different set of horns than the ones that you see on pronghorn today. That set of pronghorn horns on this one in particular, it looked like it could take a cheetah with those horns. The hooves on the pronghorn are really flexible, allow that running in the rugged terrain. They can reach a top speed of around 60 miles an hour, but they can easily cruise 35, 40 miles an hour along the side of your vehicle. And in Sheldon itself, there are times where these animals are running along with your vehicle as you're cruising down the road. It's an amazing thing to see, and it's really unbelievable when you see how rugged the terrain is that anything could run that fast out there. One of the things that makes fencing in Sheldon particularly dangerous for the pronghorn, because of their small bone structure and light weight and the way they're built as an animal for speed, they're not built rugged enough to be able to jump over things in any kind of height. And when they come to a barbed wire fence, they don't jump over. They actually get down on their elbows and crawl underneath. And so any type of fencing that's blocking any of the corridors or their escape from any kind of predator becomes much more complicated when a whole herd of animals is trying to drop down onto their elbows and crawl underneath a barbed wire fence. So before the 19th century began, the number of pronghorn on the landscape were estimated to be in the tens of millions. About 100 years after that, that number had dropped to about 13,000. And this decline in the population was caused by, obviously, settlement farming, hunting, but also the competition with agricultural livestock and the decreased resources that were available to them with the introduction of these non-native ungulates. The pronghorn need open space. They need unencumbered landscapes to be able to move back and forth and thrive. There's estimates that they could travel in an average year over 150 miles between their summer and winter. A single railroad track, a road, a fence could disrupt the migrations and cause populations to dwindle. And you look at this picture here in the center, it's tragic. The likelihood that that animal escaped from that fence is probably pretty low. This is very typical of what happens when pronghorn attempt to jump over, or if they don't break limbs on the other side, they do drag their rear legs over and get tangled in the barbed wire. The shocking figure that comes from High Country News, it's estimated that there's over 100,000 miles of barbed wire fence in the West, and that for every 2.5 miles of barbed wire fence, each year there's one ungulate death. And so if you consider the work that we've done over the past 10 years on the Sheldon Refuge, we've removed 333 miles of barbed wire fence. And if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had estimated that there was 100 miles of fence on the refuge. We definitely found more fence than 100 miles, and we've done over 3 times that much now. But it's a very rewarding thing to have young people in our AmeriCorps crews go out and realize that this statistic of the 100,000 miles in the West, and for every 2.5 miles of fence, there's an ungulate death. That's something that they can bring back home and tell people that they've really made a difference in wildlife habitat restoration by working on a crew in the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. As far as population decline for the pronghorn, between 1900 and 1925, the Homestead Act, the Carey Act, the Amended Desert Lands Act, the Timber and Stone Act, all had impacts on the population of pronghorn. In particular, the winter between 1921, 1922 were extremely bad due to a very heavy snowfall and really low temperatures and severe freezes. That was about the time where some of the local biologists decided there was things that needed to be changed. And so after that decline, some local residents and conservation groups started to look for a piece of land out in northern Nevada to protect the species. In 1920, E.R. Sands, a biologist, U.S. Biological Survey, he lived here in Reno, began planning a refuge. And he had this vision of buying some lands and setting it aside, and also to create hunting seasons, which at this point, there was no limits on hunting pronghorn in the entire state of Nevada. So in 1920, E.R. Sands convinced Washoe County to have a closed season for pronghorn. And in 1921, he did the same thing with Humboldt County. And it wasn't much later that he actually convinced the Nevada State Fish and Game Commission to have a hunting season that was for the entire state of Nevada. In 1923, the Association of Audubon Societies and the Boone and Crockett Club got together and formed the refuge. Sands met with Gilbert Pearson on a tour of Anaho Island and Pyramid Lake. The two became stranded, and they basically came to a decision that something was needed and that the refuge was going to be established. Hart and Sheldon were picked because of the open spaces and the availability of water on the refuge. And Boone and Crockett and Audubon Society bought the Last Chance Ranch in 1918. And Herbert Hoover designated the 30,000 acre area as the Charles Sheldon Wildlife Refuge in 1931. In 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt put 500,000 acres of conservation and development and natural wildlife resources aside. And that was with a land swap with the Department of the Interior. And then that was the Charles Sheldon Antelope Range. And then finally in 1978, the Sheldon Refuge and the Sheldon Antelope Range were combined into one administrative unit under Fish and Wildlife Service. The refuge mandate is to manage for the pronghorn, conserve and list any listed or threatened fish, wildlife, and plants within the refuge. And it was also to provide sanctuary for migratory birds. One of the early pronghorn biologists, the first ever pronghorn biologist, Jim Yoakum, was very involved in the Sheldon Refuge, advocated for the pronghorn all his life. And I was lucky enough, we were lucky enough as an organization to know him and work with him directly. There's an abundant species of over 271 species of animals on the refuge. It's priority habitat for the greater sage grouse, and combined with our removal of fences and restoration of water sources on the refuge, this habitat has become more and more improved over the years. Here's some photographs of some of the wildlife that you could expect to see within the refuge. It's a place where you can actually see bighorn sheep, you can see mule deer, you can see mountain lion, any number of animals, insects, birds. It's truly an amazing place to be able to view wildlife in a very natural setting. A lot of the refuge infrastructure was created by the CCC and the WPA. Their construction of dikes and dams and residence houses, such as the first ranger station at Badger, which is this building here, as well as the Little Sheldon headquarters, which is where our crew is stationed each year. The Wilderness Act of '64 provided a tool that intermeshed the objectives of the refuge and the range with potential to have the area designated as wilderness. And about 86% of the refuge is identified as potential wilderness if a campaign comes up to designate that at some point in the future. The area provides an outdoor laboratory for interpretation and demonstration of wildlife populations and habitat across the sagebrush steppe ecosystem. And what you see here in this map is the dark areas are those areas that qualify as wilderness if they are to be designated at some point in the future. The work that we do is all done by volunteers. And as I said, AmeriCorps service members and paid crews and staff. And here's one of the photographs from our large fence pool, the final fence pool, any of the large fence in the refuge at Thousand Creeks Gorge. And that's Thousand Creeks Gorge behind those folks. There's areas in that gorge that are have cliffs 600 feet high. The work in the Sheldon has been done by a number of different groups, including the Sierra Club, sportsmen's groups, conservation groups like Oregon Natural Desert Association and Friends of the Refuge, and of course, Friends of Nevada Wilderness. Already covered all that, and we will get down to the actual details of the work on the refuge. This map shows basically no work done on the refuge. There wasn't very much work done by outside groups, and the size of the staff on the refuge is only 3 people. And for 900 square miles, 3 people working every day for the rest of their lives wouldn't do anything as much as what is needed out there. And so it's only by having other groups and organizations come in and do the work that any of this stuff could be done. So between 94 and 2010, fencing and livestock developments removed or on these lines that you see on the map. And as we go down through these slides, you'll see the map change and see the amount of work that's been done by the crews that worked on the refuge with our organization, as well as other groups. The Sierra Club particularly was one of the groups that had fencing projects up here every single year and continue to do so. 2011, these were the fence lines that we removed. 2012, you see the addition of the lines to the map. And this was our first year with Greater Heart Sheldon Conservation Fund. 2013, we continue the work. This was the house that the crew is based in at the Little Sheldon headquarters. It was built by the WPA in the early 30s. And you see the change again on the maps as we progress through 2015, 2016, 2017. There are no roads up here. These kids carry this barbed wire fence and these materials on their backs out from these areas to the closest roads to be taken to the metal collection area at the Dufferina Ponds at the refuge headquarters. 2018, 2019, that's a huge pile of metal behind those kids. 2020 and 2021, this was our season this year. And so far, 333 miles of barbed wire fence, 131 tons of metal garbage, and 57 non-functioning water developments have been removed from the refuge. It's a wide open space, and these young people make a tremendous difference working with the AmeriCorps program and Friends of Nevada Wilderness. And as we continue our way forward and with support from our funders, we anticipate doing this into the future. And with that, I will end things here and go back to questions.
Well, Pat, that was an amazing program, and my goodness, that's a lot of metal.
It
very
is
impressed.
it's a tremendous amount of metal when you see it on the ground.
So does, you said that, you know, you guys have to carry it out, and how do you dispose of it? Is it like, is it, you know, how you can go to scrap metal yards, or is it a little different because it's odd pieces of metal and wire? I'm just curious. I don't know this answer.
Well, it is a huge amount of metal, and it is in a giant pile in what was the it was the area that they used to process the horses through when horses were gathered on the refuge.
Okay.
The horses are gone now, and a large area in the back of the refuge headquarters is where we just pile the metal. And as yet, because of the location being so far away, we haven't found anybody that wants to come up and pick up this scrap. They need a giant claw truck to come up and get it, and then they would have to load it and then take it somewhere. So financially, it hasn't really been feasible to get it, but hopefully at some point we can recycle it.
Oh, absolutely. My gosh, that's, yeah, you almost need a grant just to do that.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a couple questions here. You said there are no roads. Does that mean they carry the wire and all this metal miles and miles to a single road? Or can you a little bit explain about if people wanted to explore, you know, what kind of roads are out there, and, you know,
So
help them, I guess.
there's a small stretch of paved road, Highway 140, that goes from Denio, Nevada up to Adel, Oregon, and cuts through the northern part of the refuge.
Oh, okay.
So that's the only paved road within the entire refuge, and it's a 2-lane paved highway. And within the refuge, there are 2 alternate state highways, Highway 8A and Highway 34A, and they are improved gravel roads. And then everything else in Sheldon is a 2-track. And
So just a dirt road.
well, yeah, not even a road. It's just a 2-track.
Oh, okay, okay,
Just 2 tire tracks with vegetation down the middle, and
okay,
it's extremely rough country to travel in, and we carry a lot of specialized equipment just to be able to travel back and forth.
okay,
We rescue people all the time who don't have adequate tires, or
okay.
in fact, my crews have saved people's lives on the refuge that have had accidents and been lost up there.
Okay. Wow. Can you know how you had the map, where are there water sources within the Sheldon range? I know there's, some of the wetlands, but is there a lot of water or just kind of a little bit of water in different areas for the pronghorn
So
and other animals?
there's a couple of areas that have larger bodies of water. One of them is Catnip Reservoir, and it has a functioning population of Lahontan cutthroat trout. And there is fishing there. And also at the east side of the refuge, in the main refuge headquarters area, there are the ponds at Dufferina Ranch. And there's also a warm spring at the Virgin Valley Campground. That campground is free and open to the public and has a warm spring, showers, and pit toilets. And there's also pit toilets at the Catnip Reservoir. Other than that, it's mostly little bodies of water here and there, springs and seeps and catchments that are just basically holding water, natural snow pockets and things like that.
Okay, okay. Did you say how big the population of the pronghorn were? I don't know if I actually heard that, I mean, you have such a large area, and you were talking about how fence lengths, could kill the pronghorn, but do you know an estimate of kind of the number of pronghorn that are on the range?
I think in the last couple of flyover surveys that the Fish and Wildlife Service have done, I think is probably between 26 and 2,800 pronghorn on the refuge.
Wow. Okay. And there's enough food and water to easily keep the population going and
Yeah, obviously there's drought at this point, and
Yeah.
things are difficult. Some of the water sources are no longer available. But
okay.
yeah, in general, the landscape within the Sheldon boundaries, because it is got a perimeter fence and the feral horses and burros were removed a few years ago,
Oh,
that this is kind of a living laboratory of what a wild place in Nevada can be without the effects of feral horses and burros. There's no cows, there's no horses, it's just native wildlife within the refuge.
wow, that is, you really can study that, and they're not competing against with other animals. Oh, that's amazing. I do have another question.
Sure.
What are the dimensions of the refuge? And also does the range of the pronghorn go outside of the refuge area?
Okay, so I will tell you that officially I'm not really good at math and numbers, but
I understand.
the southern boundary is probably about 30 miles. The northern boundary is about 50 or 60 miles.
Okay.
And it's about maybe 40 miles high, but it's a weird shape.
Yeah.
The pronghorn do travel back and forth through the refuge fence. The fence on the outside of the refuge, the perimeter fence, and any fence to be built from here forward is called antelope friendly fence. And so the bottom wire is higher off the
Yes.
ground, and it is also not barbed, so that the pronghorn can move through without additional hazards.
Okay, I've seen that kind of fencing when we are going through wells up into Idaho. And
For
there's
sure.
the bridge and stuff. So it's a different fencing. So it's for wildlife to
Right.
pass. So okay, all right. I understand now.
One of the things that we also do as an organization is just post markers on fencing so that the sage grouse with poor eyesight can see the fence and they don't become entangled in them as well. And so there's
Oh,
all kinds of issues with fencing in the West.
wow. Well, that's interesting. So you were saying they kind of migrate to the sage hens and the birds too?
Yeah, they
or do
move
they
back
kind of
and
stay?
forth as well. Yeah.
Okay.
It's
okay.
amazing how far those birds move for the efficiency of their flight is not the best. But they
Yeah.
do move quite a bit across the landscape there.
Okay. Is there a pretty big population within the range for the birds?
Unfortunately, sage grouse populations have been dwindling everywhere, and very it's a little disheartening to see their numbers dropping the way they do. Jim Sedinger from the University of Nevada, Reno has done a lot of work on the sage grouse populations in Sheldon.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'd
Okay.
refer anybody to his research is probably the most current and detailed as far as sage grouse populations, but we do see them quite often during the season.
Okay. Okay. Is there were you surprised by any animal when you first came on of when you started working with the Sheldon Refuge, of animals you maybe didn't think would be around? Or
Well, I think the treat for the kids that have worked for us over the years is that every year we've seen mountain lion, and that's something that people have lived here all their lives and never seen. And we also see every year we see good numbers of bighorn sheep.
Nice. Well, I see Neal raised his hand, so he wanted to ask a question as well.
I wanted to know more about the awards, the importance of them, and things like the one that you received in Washington, D.C., and what kind of response and other people were interested along with you being a recipient. That's number one.
Well, I guess I'd have to say a couple things. Number one, that I'm not a special person. I'm just an everyday person, and I obviously have a passion for the outdoors, and I find restorative value in being outdoors. And once I moved to Nevada from California in 1982, I realized that this place was special. And every time I went out, I found myself cleaning up after other people and trying to take care of things that were out there. And it grew in me that I started just to travel out with no maps and no idea where I was going. I'd go out, find a place to camp, get up the next day and hike around or drive around and just see what I could see. And I think I could do that for the rest of my life in Nevada and never see something I wasn't happy with, or see the same thing twice, or not be surprised by some incredible beauty or something out there that was just spectacular. And I was working in a cafe in Reno. I overheard some people talking at the next table, and I was rubbing a hole in the table while I was eavesdropping, and they were talking about this job. And uncharacteristically, I tapped this person on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I overheard you saying something, and if you have a job that pays somebody to do that, I'm your guy. And luckily, 2 weeks later, I was in an interview with Sharon Netherton, our executive director, and I explained, my passions for the outdoors and wild places. I really didn't understand public lands at that time. I didn't understand wilderness at that time, but Sharon believed in me enough that she gave me a chance at this job. And that was the beginning of our stewardship program. And within a few years, we were starting to get national awards. And it wasn't because I was in that job. It was because I was lucky enough to gather the right people together to get those things accomplished. And, it was a big honor for me to go to Washington, D.C. and get the Bob Marshall Award on behalf of our Forest Service work. The Group Champion of Wilderness Stewardship Award is a huge thing. And, sharing that with all our volunteers and our staff was an amazing experience in itself. A few years later, we were at an event in the Black Rock Desert where they started talking about somebody who had done a lot of work and committed to doing stewardship on the Black Rock Desert. And I was waiting for them to call out this person's name and call them up, and they called me. And I was shocked. I mean, truly, I was doing my job, and they found it important enough that I got recognized for that. And that's probably one of the coolest things, because I was able to get a cadastral survey marker from the BLM that was inscribed to me. And I probably one of my most cherished possessions. But BLM Winnemucca also nominated me for the Volunteer of the Year 2012 Making a Difference Award in Washington, D.C. That's where my parents were able to come out and go to DC with me. That's when my dad finally realized I wasn't just camping and that I had a job that was real. And so, all those things are not necessarily a result of me doing anything other than my job. And I think it's important for people to remember, as I said in the beginning, that public lands are important. They're a national treasure, and it's not government land. It's managed by the federal government for the American people, and anybody can do something to make the country a better place. It just takes an action. And, I've just been lucky. I've been able to work with great young people who have come up through the organization. Our current human resources person and soon to be associate director I hired her as a 19-year-old AmeriCorps service member very early in my tenure here. And she's now, running the organization with everybody else. And, it's great to be working with a group of people who are dedicated to public lands and conservation as the people I've met through this job.
Well, you are very dedicated and a special, and I want to emphasize the word special. I disagree with you not thinking that you are, but it's people like you that bring and recognize pride of this great state. I am grateful to you.
I appreciate that, Neal. Coming from you, that's a special thing in itself.
So I got one last question. All of the outdoor cooking and your association with those wonderful Dutch oven pots, what's your favorite recipe? And I'll stop there.
I think so a number of years ago, working with the Nevada Outdoor School in Winnemucca, The founder and executive director at that time, Stephanie Lefevre, she and I had a rivalry of cooking, and that's what eventually became the Black Rock Desert, High Rock Canyon Immigrant Trails National Conservation Area Dutch Oven Championship. And it was all kind of a joke, and it was all kind of between she and I and what we did back and forth to feed everybody that was out on our events. And we partner with Nevada Outdoor School and Friends of Black Rock on some of the events out there. And it's now grown to, at Black Rock Rendezvous and National Public Lands Day, when we're out on the ground, it's become a big thing, and there's 15, 20 people now involved in these contests. But I was able to get a deer roast from Dan Hines, who was one of our former members, and his wife, Karen Boger, is still on our board of directors. And it was such a beautiful piece of meat. And I made a venison stew with it with parsnips and carrots. And I still think it's probably one of my best creations. And it was, a Nevada mule deer. And it was a guy who hunts with black powder, and it all came together to make an incredible Dutch oven dish.
Beautiful.
Well, we want to thank you, Pat. It was a wonderful program, learned so much. And yeah, I definitely want to go up there and check out the area. So I knew little bits, but I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody else has as well. So thank you for being a wonderful speaker today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And anyone could go to that website, click on the Explore tab and scroll down and go to that presentation again. I know there was parts there that went kind of quick, and some of those photos deserve a better look. So I'd encourage anyone to go to the website and look at it again.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. There's some really beautiful photos. So, and it was also you also have dark sky, correct?
Yeah, well, we worked as an organization with the BLM, the Applegate Field Office, to get the Massacre Rim Wilderness Study Area, which is just to the south of the Sheldon Refuge, to the southwest corner of the refuge, designated as an International Dark Skies Association Dark Skies Sanctuary, which means it is truly like the darkest places in the world that get the sanctuary status. There's dark parks, there's dark areas, but this is dark sky sanctuary. So some of the darkest skies on the planet.
Wow. Wow. No, and people love to go out there and really enjoy the nighttime. So definitely, if people don't know about it, they definitely should check that out as well. So
most definitely.
Thank you again, Pat, and I'll send it back to Samantha. And thank you guys so much, as always, for helping us support our programming and get wonderful speakers like Pat out, so everyone can learn a little bit more about Nevada history. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Sherry Hayes Zorn and Neal Cobb and Pat Bruce with the Nevada Historical Society, and Russell, our Washoe County Library Systems Tech Wizard, for making this event possible today. Thank you. Have a great one.